Welcome back everyone to the latest episode ng Deep Dive. Ito na, medyo feeling all-star naman tayo from three different time zones. This is Richard Haydarn joining you live from University of Oxford right now kung saan nagpapalamig ako literally and figuratively. We're joined today again, of course, with Professor Leloy Claudio from University of California, Berkeley, Southeast Asian Department, and of course from University of Chicago. Ito na, matagal namin iniidolo yan. Binabasa ko yung work niya. I've cited some of your works. I don't know if Marco, you have seen this. We have Associate Professor of Sociology, Marco Garrido. One of the things I love with our two guests today is that they wear many hats. Of course, Leloy, everyone knows him, always being pasaway, always being iconoclastic. But Marco has a background in civil society, in journalism, and now full-fledged sociologist. And that's why I really like your perspective because it covers all the important grounds. Marco, you have a new book coming. Leloy just got his book out. Me, I have to revise mine because I have to find a new publisher in Oxford. Before we go there, Marco, there are really two major themes I want to discuss today.
Mhm.
Uh, Populism, which I'll discuss rather later on. But the first one, and this is where Leloy is making a lot of trouble for me, this issue of corruption.
Opa. Mm.
You said something that is even more Leloy than Leloy. You use the term, what, like anti-corruption fundamentalism?
Yes.
What do you mean by that? You mean like yun, parang hindi naman Taliban like 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 what do you mean? It's like obsession with just corruption is everything. Like, can you explain to us, Professor Garrido?
Yeah, sige. Salamat, Richard. And it's a compliment to be called more Leloy than Leloy. So I'll take it in that vein. Okay, so it comes out of this paper, A Thousand Years of Corruption, that's in Comparative Studies in Society and History. The idea there is that people are so focused on corruption. They treat it as a problem that's generic. In other words, it's the same thing all around the world. It's the same thing throughout time. And all they want to do is solve it. And so it's really a problem-solving approach to corruption. They treat corruption as if it were a social problem. So that's fine, to treat it as a social problem. A social problem is something you want to solve. And so the focus really is on finding a solution to it. Another way to think about corruption, though, is as a sociological problem. So that's actually very different. So to think of corruption as a sociological problem really means to try to understand it. So maybe to set aside the impulse to solve it for the moment, but really try to understand what's happening, what's going on, and to not take for granted that, in fact, corruption in one place, in one time, is exactly the same thing as corruption in another place, in another time. To understand sociologically that that the meaning of things really depends on the context in which they're embedded, both historical context and social context. And that leads to a completely different approach. You really have to understand, when people talk about corruption at this point in time, what do they mean? And why, for instance, does it excite people so much? I mean, what's behind it? I mean, you really only have to look at our history in the Philippines. People assume that when people talk about corruption, it's been the exact same thing for the last, say, 78 years since independence, no? And in fact, if you construct a table just listing corruption scandals, as I do in that paper, in some ways your suspicions are confirmed. Oh, there's a corruption scandal after corruption scandal after corruption scandal. There's every single administration, there's at least half a dozen corruption scandals. And so it goes to prove a suspicion that in fact Filipinos are corrupt. And so the title of the paper is A Thousand Years of Corruption because it feels like, even though we've had our independence now for 78, 79 years, it feels like it's been 1,000 years. Right. And so it's become a diagnosis of ourselves and it becomes an indictment of who we are as a people. And by that point, there's really nothing you can do when corruption becomes genetic in that way. But in fact, if you look at corruption in the 50s, in the 60s, in the 70s, and the 80s, it's a moving object. It's meant very, very different things across time, from the Golden Arenola to Marcos. I mean, with Marcos, yeah, he was spectacularly corrupt, of course. But if you read historical documents, you begin to understand that in some ways, what really outraged people was how scandalous his corruption was in the face of inequality. And it was really at a moment in time where economically people were really feeling the pinch because economically the country wasn't doing well. Poverty was increasing, and people were feeling that at the same time. Marcos, in his extravagance, I mean, these things you have to understand, they're not really illegal. To have a gold gilt comb or something, a bejeweled comb, is not necessarily illegal. But in the face of spectacular poverty, it starts to feel wrong. The point I'm trying to make here is there's a particular moral economy that you have to take into account. And so to do that, you can't simply assume, well, that's corruption and that's how people react. You have to understand the moment. You have to understand the time. You have to understand the actors behind it. Otherwise, you're misunderstanding a lot. So let me, that's a kind of a long-winded explanation, but let me go back to this anti-corruption fundamentalism. So we're at a point now where we treat corruption as if it's the same thing everywhere. But we know people who do historical work know this is not true. It's the same thing everywhere, and the only thing you can do is to fix it. And so we tabulate its costs. We imagine these costs being, we have less money, we're less capable, we're less democratic, all of these kinds of things. So we have to mobilize ourselves to somehow solve corruption. The problem is, I don't think that's possible given how unrealistic this conceit is that corruption is this thing that we're just conceiving it in a way that's just not realistic. We pretend that it's this generic problem but in fact, it's a distinctly Filipino problem. And in fact, if you look at that table of corruption scandals that I mentioned, it's been accompanied consistently by anti-corruption movements in some form or another. It doesn't have to be social movements. It can be hearings. It can be some kind of outrage. Um, and so really, when you talk about corruption, you're really talking about what our politics looks like. And it's a moving conversation. It's a conversation that's developed over time. And to really appreciate the progress that we've made, yes, the progress, you have to understand corruption as something that can only be understood in context. And so fundamentalism, just the analogy, I suppose, is, religious fundamentalists kind of take things literally, right? And they take what is a complicated story and make it very, very simple. And the reason they do that is because it provides moral clarity. It provides moral orientation. And so there's something comfortable about that. You feel like, oh, okay, I know what the problem is. I know how to solve it. The problem is we scholars are used to complicated stories, not simple ones. And we know that there's a trade-off. You get a simple story, but by glossing over the complications, you may find yourself in an impossible situation. And I think that's what's happened to us. So I'll stop there. I have more to say, but
Yeah, no,
Uh,
we're getting into
I have a
Go
question,
ahead, Lel.
Marco, because in
sige.
that paper
Sige,
it
sige.
seems like you arrived at this solution gradually. Like lahat
Yes.
tayo, we arrived at this position gradually because
Yeah, yeah,
we were part of activists. We were activists, and we also read a lot of literature particularly in political science about corruption. And then
yeah,
slowly we realized, unang-una intellectually, and I want to get to the intellectual part later on.
yeah, yeah,
Intellectually, may mga pagkukulang to. And then
yeah, yeah,
pangalawa, as a form of political activism, it doesn't necessarily root itself deeply in the kind of real politics that
yeah,
people are involved with. And what's fascinating about that paper, it's that it seems as if you came to this realization slowly as you were reflecting on what it was like to be a journalist in the 90s, right? This is in the high point of PCIJ. And
yeah,
then
yeah,
sa mga activists naman, the equivalent, as you say, was the Institute of Popular Democracy.
yeah,
What was it about, late 90s, 10 years after Marcos and then after
yeah,
the Asian financial crisis
yeah.
that made you start to think about the issue of corruption?
Yeah, I know that I love that question because it allows me to kind of really talk about what led me to these ideas. So first of all, I was a journalist in the 2000s. Hindi naman ako, I'm not that old, but
Eloy, ano ka ba,
Oh,
but but
Hindi
almost
naman.
oh.
the 2000
Late 90s, early 2000s,
to, to,
post-financial
to,
crisis,
oh,
yes.
tama.
Uh,
I want to start by saying, you know, this idea of corruption, this whole agenda behind it, in these to talk about Philippine politics in terms of these so-called bad words, corruption being one of them, but also oligarchy, democratic deficit, patronage, and so on. I want to be clear that this is how I learned to think about the Philippines. No, these are agendas I subscribed to enthusiastically. I believed in, and I believed that this was the correct cause. This was righteous. Um, and so, in the early 2000s, as a journalist, I covered a number of issues, everything from, what's happening in Mindanao to Pacquiao to politics, of course. And I was in the country when EDSA 2 and EDSA 3 happened. And even then, I started to feel unsettled by the vehemence, by how strongly people reacted against so-called etcetres, against the mass and the reaction people had against it. So I suppose that's when it started feeling unsettled. But even then, I was very much a part of different NGOs. And I subscribe to this agenda that we need to reform Philippine politics, and this is the only way. We need to get rid of corruption. Corruption's the major problem. In fact, it was the only way to think about politics. But as a journalist, and then, later as an academic, but even as an academic, what I really signed up for was to study the Philippines as an ethnographer, which means to spend a lot of time in the country, to listen to people, to try to understand how they see things. And in a way, I was a slow learner over time, listening to these people talk about politics. Now, people from different walks of life, people who lived in formal settlements, middle class people in gated communities, politicians, non-politicians. If you take them seriously and with some sympathy, you begin to realize that this righteous cause that I myself believed in, that this is how you reform Philippine politics. This is the only issue. Well, first, how complex it was, how multi-sided it was, and how kulang it was as a diagnosis of the actual situation in the Philippines. So it is really over time that, with urban poor, for instance, you begin to realize that simply discounting them is insufficient, saying that, bobo sila, mga bobotantes. I mean, that all of a sudden those explanations pale. But even with corruption, you talk to people who participate, who are supposed to be involved, you begin to realize that the situation is much, much more complicated. In some ways, it depends on all of these, let's call them sociological factors. Whose perspective is it? What other factors are happening? What is the actual situation? Is it really, say, patronage, or is it perhaps clientelism, but more complicated than that? Um, and in some cases, you begin to wonder, okay, so they're calling this corruption, but is there any other way to do it? Or is this simply normal behavior? And if it's normal, and nobody agrees there's any real transgression, why do we call it corruption? What do we get out of it? And so you begin to start asking these deeper questions. And so to answer your question, Leloy, over time, really, I would credit time and exposure to Philippine reality in a very concrete way in all its forms that slowly eroded this certainty that this cause was the best analysis, the best diagnosis of the situation in the Philippines, and led me to ask, as well as others, of course, more, to pull the string, as it were. And once you start to pull that strings, you begin to realize, oh my gosh, the way we think about things might be too simple. Maybe we need a more complicated analysis. But that requires more than just one scholar, more than just me. It requires historians like you, it requires economists, it requires political scientists. But I think I've come to believe now that the task is to try to reimagine Philippine politics away from these so-called bad words. Why? Because thinking about it as we've been so accustomed to doing, just in terms of these bad words, traps us. It traps us. And I don't think there's a way out of it. And it makes us feel terrible about ourselves. And that self-doubt, that loss of confidence
Right.
is
Now we're
debilitating.
getting to the meat of this. No, I want to play the devil's advocate, Lela. Sorry, Lela. I know you want to go right into this. I mean, just to be clear, I mean, here in your paper, you talk about corruption under Manuel Rojas, 1946 and 1948, the war surplus scandals. Under Quirino, you had the Chinese immigration quota racket. Under Ramon Magsaysay, national rights. So a devil's advocate response would be like, aren't you guys just over sociologizing this? I mean, what are you guys talking about? This is clearly bad. I mean, what is the debate here? This is a war surplus scandal. Someone was pocketing something. Someone was
Right.
making money from the immigration quota. Someone was making something out of the National Rice and Corn Corporation scandal. So what is Marco Garita? What is your problem, Marco? Like, this is wrong. So what is wrong with Filipino people getting angry at this? This is obviously wrong.
Well, exactly. But you have to take people's reactions that this is wrong into account. So all of those things you mentioned were met with outrage, met with people reacting and saying something's wrong. And you begin to realize if you just focus on corruption, And you say, we've been saying something's wrong, for decades now, and yet nothing's changed. But in fact, historically, a lot has changed because it's led to all kinds of reactions, whether reactions within the government or itself, reactions in civil society, and those reactions have clearly had an effect. I mean, most spectacularly, they've led to the ouster of two presidents. But beyond that, our own relationship to corruption, and by the way, corruption is really how we're talking about politics, and we need to understand corruption within the context of this larger project of, let's call it, political modernization, right? Now you have to understand this project of political modernization for other places that we sometimes look up to, maybe not anymore, but sometimes, places like the United States, that took a long, long, long time to happen. And what we call corruption, the things that we're accustomed to, were very normal, was quite normal behavior politically in places like Chicago, for instance, the political machine, the vote buying, these kinds of things. But times changed, people changed, and this kind of churning happened, and it led to, the transformation of politics. Philippines itself, we never give ourselves we don't cut ourselves that kind of slack. We expect to be modernized like that. We don't understand that these things are part of a process. We don't see that we ourselves are part of a process. And all those things you mentioned from the Arinola forward, represent a kind of churning, this process of political modernization that's happening. And so we need to give ourselves credit for not just the corruption scandals, but for the anti-corruption scandals that have accompanied them.
Okay,
And so
now
that,
I think,
yeah,
sorry,
go
Mark.
ahead.
This is really an intense discussion. I can imagine people squirming. Ano pinagsasabi itong mga tatlong academic na to? Basically, ang point mo is this. Akala ng tao walang pagbabago nangyari, paulit-ulit lang itong
Tama,
corruption na
tama.
to. Ang sinasabi mo is, actually, nag-mutate yung corruption dahil nagre-respond siya sa social mobilization,
Ah,
sa political reform. Kumbaga, kasama ito sa ongoing struggle of political modernization and democratic development. This is basically your argument, right? Just to be clear.
Absolutely. That's my argument, but I'm also saying that there's a danger of this anti-corruption fundamentalism, right? I mean, if we understand it in context, we see that there's been this ongoing process of working out politics. So you need to take both the corruption and the anti-corruption into account when you think about the Philippines historically. In addition, this idea that the problem, to limit our view to just, oh, this is corruption, we've always been corruption, this is very important to me. I'm saying that is debilitating. That attitude is debilitating. It's more healthy to understand that we ourselves have been engaged in this process and that there has been progress in the course of political modernization from
Okay.
historically.
Before I go
And,
to the
and uh,
market,
ako mabilis lang. When you say anti-corruption, you should also take anti-corruption into consideration, meaning you should also deconstruct the logic of anti-corruption, especially when it's applied to cases like yung pag-dismiss natin ng EDSA tres, di ba? These are just stupid people supporting a corrupt government. And then of course, we know na maraming elitism associated with the anti-corruption cause. Itong mga bobong masa na to, ninanakawan na sila, hindi naman nila alam na it's bad for them, binibigyan lang sila ng serbisyo, binibigyan sila ng dole-out na ninako ng gobyerno, okay na sa kanila. Yung ganong klaseng elitism which has been part and parcel of kind of reformist anti-corruption rhetoric for, and this one, maybe this is a thousand years old, I don't know.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, okay, so good. I'm really glad that you brought that up, Leloy. So, even our current enthusiasm for anti-corruption these days, I mean, where does it come from? Is it in fact something that's kind of been there since the beginning of the Republic? In fact, Leloy brought up the PCIJ, Leloy brought up, those books have a context that it's important to keep in mind. So in the 1990s, late 1990s, corruption was put on the agenda very deliberately by certain actors, right? I mean, so James Wolfenson, the World Bank president at the time, really denounced this quote unquote cancer of corruption. The OECD, the United States, again, interested in free trade, in opening borders, saw corruption as a problem in the sense of opening markets. More than that, a kind of international civil society represented by organizations like Transparency International started quantifying corruption, defining it very narrowly in terms of bribery, and then quantifying corruption. Transparency International does this ranking that makes front page news. I have to understand all of that stuff wasn't around in the 60s and 70s. It really emerged in the late 90s and 2000s. And it's in that context that organizations like the PCIJ and the IPD really start to think about corruption in this very narrow utilitarian way. So the main intellectual architect of this stuff is a woman called Susan Rose Ackerman, an economist from Yale, lawyer economist from Yale, who starts to conceive corruption in utilitarian terms. Ibig sabihin, what corruption is about self-interest at the end of the day. And the way to solve it is to get your incentives right, to fix the institutions so that the incentives are right. This is a very, very narrow way of thinking about corruption. It used to be thought about more sociologically. Somebody like Samuel Huntington could only conceive of corruption in the context of the process of political modernization. Why? Because modernization made the boundary between public and private bright. If corruption means the transgression of public and private, no? I mean, you take, stuff that's meant for the public, the government, and you bring it into your household, the private. Huntington argued that modernization is precisely about making these boundaries distinct, these spheres separate. So corruption can only be understood in the context of modernization. My point is, there was a time where even intellectuals around the world understood corruption in a much more embedded way. But really starting, you see this pivot in the late 90s, certainly the 2000s, intellectually, it begins to change. The conception of corruption begins to change. Plus, all this money starts pouring in. You have to remember that this is the third wave. Countries are democratizing, including the Philippines, and so much money is pouring in, not just to make countries to consolidate democracy, so to speak, but also to get rid of corruption, right? I mean, this was the whole campaign so my point is, you take something like the PCIJ and you have to understand their anti-corruption agenda or the IPD, their anti-corruption agenda in some ways, was funded by a set of global funders whose priorities had emerged in a very particular way in the early 2000s. So if you subtract that, you fundamentally misunderstand. Parang corruption has been always some kind of mortal sin, some kind of original sin, and you have to solve it. Okay, I'll stop there, but you get the point I'm trying.
Maanghang na, Richard.
Medyo, ito na, ito na. Now
Sabi ni
we're,
Lilo
the real talk. No, 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 gusto ko yan. So, basically, ang unang-unang sinasabi natin dito is immanent, no? Doon sa
yeah,
modernization process, ang
yeah,
ganito,
yeah, yeah, yeah,
transgression of the private versus public. This is something, like, yung yung namimigay ng yung alpha male nung
yeah, tama.
pre-modern era, it was not seen as a corruption. It became
Yeah,
corruption when you create a
ex-
constitutional rule of law
ex-
order. Exactly.
exactly.
So, una-una, like, we have to get this intellectually right. So first, it's immanent. Second,
Tama.
it's a byproduct of the, creation of the rule of law and all of that. So,
Tama, hindi siya eternal. Hindi siya,
exactly.
hindi siya parang you have to understand it in context.
Absolutely. But the other thing I wanted to say, Marco and Lele, this is the term I use, self-orientalization, which Lele also has been harping on. This idea that, oh, we are like singularly, exceptionally, helplessly corrupt people. Tignan mo, scandal 1920s, scandal 1940s. And actually, a while ago, I wanted to go to Leloy because we had an episode together last week. We have a lot of Reddit fans thanks to Leloy's iconoclastic. What Lele was saying is kung pinanood mo yung movie na Quezon, and Manolo Quezon also had similar very good reading on this, I really suggest this. Kung binasa mo yan, basically it confirms your argument, Marco. This idea that yung anger at corruption is becoming basically an anti-politics cynicism. This idea na, tingnan
Yeah.
mo, Commonwealth pa lang,
Yeah.
founding father pa lang natin,
Yeah.
napakakurakot ng mga to. Walang
Yeah.
nagbago sa
Yeah.
Pilipinas.
Yeah.
This is the
Yeah.
same hopeless system. So, Lele was absolutely correct. Manolo was absolutely correct about this. And this just confirms your thesis that this essentialist, right,
Yes.
understanding of corruption in the Philippines creates a very dangerous anti-politics, anti-democratic cynicism.
Absolutely. And practically, how does it do that? It makes people cynical and it tells them there's no way politically we can solve this problem because the problem is in our soul. It's us. And so, what is the solution? The solution is some kind of deus ex machina, some strong leader to come out of nowhere, to suspend all of the processes and to fix things despite ourselves. And that's inviting another Marcos. I mean, you have to understand the promise of Marcos was swept, arguably, certainly he propounded a decolonization agenda. The idea was something is wrong with us as Filipinos, and I'm here to fix it. The answer is bagong lipunan, a new society. So my particular concern with this anti-corruption fundamentalism is it negates the value, the necessity of politics and, of course, democracy. It opens the way for some kind of authoritarian deus ex machina to suspend politics and to solve our problems. But that's magical thinking.
And also, Richard, if I may add, it suspends the need for economics. And this is where it's interesting. Sa tingin ko itong discussion natin of anti-corruption or
Yan
critiquing the
na,
way
yan na,
we
yan na, yan
creating
na. Let's go,
anti-corruption.
let's go.
It's so interesting because Marco is coming at it from below through ethnography. And then somebody like Jesus Felipe, who studies the macroeconomy, he's studying it from above. Um, but the conclusion is the same, that we are losing hope when we don't need to lose hope. And it's so fascinating na may bottom up and may top down critique of the same phenomenon that's happening in a kind of, I think, middle intellectual zone, a kind of Weberian middle intellectual zone. Sorry, I shouldn't be using those terms. Medyo mas public yung podcast. I just wanted to say to this economic point, it's really interesting because Marco brought up the IMF, the World Bank in the 1990s. They were promoting anti-corruption. I think Ha-Joon Chang says very clear yung agenda nito. Yung agenda nito nung time na yun was for them to be able to wash their hands of the problems they had created. Because in the 1990s, they had forcibly opened up economies, right? In-implement nila yung neoliberalism, right? They had created shock therapy across the world. Tapos all of these projects gumuho. And this became very clear during the Asian financial crisis. And so they needed another explanation for it. And the other explanation was corruption. Para bang sinabi nila, hindi namin to kasalanan na sinira namin yung mundo. Kasalanan nito ng mga corrupt politiko sa Asia. And so, tayo naman bilang mga self-orientalizer, we listen to them and say, hindi nyo nga kasalanan. Kasalanan itong mga corrupt politicos who are steepling their fingers, right? And then nawala na tayo ng pag-asa again. And that's why it's so fascinating that the kind of sociologist working on the ground, the ethnographer, says the same thing as the macroeconomist. Grabe yung convergence. I find it really fascinating.
It's
Now
fascinating. So
that
basically, what we're saying is it's anti-politics. It's also anti-economics in a sense that no. As long as hindi kurakot yung leader natin, everything will be perfect. Forget about industrial policy. Forget
yeah.
about trade strategy. Forget about all of those little tweaking orthodox economic strategies you need to make a country successful. We just pigeonhole all of that and say all we need is malinis na gobyerno, maayos na presidente, and then everything will be fine. Except we got Pinoy, and Pinoy did not succeed in bringing about inclusive development. 76% of newly created growth in 2011 and 12 went to 40 richest families, according to the World Bank. This is the same year that World Bank said we're Asia's new rising tiger economy. So if the best that our liberal reformism was to offer that level of economic concentration, mukhang may problema tayo when we say, hindi na kailang pag-usapan ng economics. All we need is just malinis na gobyerno, right? And what
Tama,
we're saying, why not even a dictator na malinis? Make it even simpler. Take out the elections, everything will be simple.
and Pinoy wasn't even totally malinis. I mean, lest we forget, there was the whole PDAP pork barrel scandal and others. I mean, he holds his own among the list of scandals that visited that administration. And so it really begs the question: or is such a thing possible, or is our standard unrealistic, diba? And to this point about self-orientalizing, dagdag ko lang, we should remember that it's not just the Philippines. Sometimes we feel like we're the problem, woe is us, so on and so forth. But you begin to read more widely and you begin to realize that other countries feel the same way. There's a famous book by Chinua Achebe, Nigeria, and he has a book, it's called The Trouble with Nigeria. And he starts off by saying, when two Nigerians get together, the first thing they talk about is all the problems that beset their country. And they always complain how corrupt it is. There's no other country as corrupt as us, as Nigeria. My point is, if that feels familiar, that should tell you something, right? That it's not just an us problem. We think we phrase it in terms of something is wrong with us, but once we begin to understand that feeling this way in some ways is a structural symptom or outcome, I think it begins to free us up to think more creatively about how Yes. Sorry, Richard, we lost you.
Hindi natuwa yata sa sinasabi natin. No, no, no.
Ah,
We're going back to this. Yeah, yeah. The self-orientalization, no?
Yeah, yeah,
But I like the point that you made on like on other countries. May term kami ni Lelo dyan, negative exceptionalism. Yung
yeah.
idea na tayo lang Pinoy ay may ganito, ganito. And I
Oh,
said, every time someone complains about traffic in the like, have you been to like Mumbai? It's like, have you
exactly.
seen taxi drivers in Cairo? Like, it's like, ang problema kasi ng Pinoy, kino-compare tayo sa Norway and New Zealand. And, like, it's great to compare to those countries. Pero, medyo tumingin ka naman sa gilid-gilid natin. We're actually very similar to many developing countries, right?
Yeah,
I
yeah,
always show this, like traffic rush hour in Bangladesh versus Manila. Like, no,
yeah.
this is not to insult other countries. You know, Marco, I got into trouble. I'm persona non grata in a couple of cities now because I use Human Development Index
oh,
comparison.
ingat ka, tama
Yan
na.
ako ngayon, right? But all I'm saying is that yun nga, may tendency tayo to think we are the worst in the world, tayo
Yeah,
lang ganito. And that breeds a dangerous, dangerous kind
yeah,
of cynicism. Can we focus on that, both Lelo and Marco? Uh, in what ways do we see manifestations of this anti-politics, anti-democratic cynicism? Kasi papunta na tayo dun sa populism discussion mo, di ba, Marco? You were
mm,
talking about yung elitist tendencies of the middle class in the Philippines. And Lele also mentioned that a while ago. And the numbers show that, right? If you look at the surveys, all of them show that the ABC and the most educated Filipinos voted the most for Duterte. I'm talking about exit polls even,
yeah.
right?
Yes,
Sara
yes.
also, very high number in 2022. Until today, there was an earlier this year survey, Pulse Asia. They put Digong among like I don't know why they put an ICC level criminal in that list, but Digong is the highest, most popular than I mean
Yeah,
more popular than Sara or sorry Marcos. But you know what's interesting? The ABC had a majority approval trust of Digong, even when he was in detention in ICC. So something is
yeah,
really going on here, Marco, right? And this is something you have been investigating since your first work, Patchwork City, and also your analysis of the EDSA DOS. Pwede ba natin balikan yan? Because my mentor Walden talks about counter-revolution and
mm,
this kind of elitist middle class that he saw from Chile to Thailand and beyond. Pwede tayo mag-transition dyan para magigets ng tao bakit tayo we are against corruption, but we're against a certain type of narrative about corruption that
yeah.
shuts down democratic discourse and
Correct,
public economic policy discussion, right?
correct,
Again, I'm just clarifying this because Marco, I know
correct.
you're coming in as an academic, but for some of us who have skin in the political game,
Yeah,
I'm very sure there are people there just waiting to twist our words and say, nagsama yung tatlong pro-corruption. Normal lang daw, maganda lang daw yung corruption, okay lang, wag na natin pansinin. They do that, di ba, Leloy? That's what they say.
yeah,
Wala daw tayong problema sa corruption, apparently.
Well, yeah, and then later on I want to talk about yung mga metaphors about corruption. Like ngayon pinakabagong metaphor na ginagamit yung leaky bucket. Like you don't pour water into a leaky bucket. So what are these
And
people
make the
saying?
bucket bigger or put more water
Oh,
in the
make the
bucket. Yeah, yung mga
it's
ganyan, ek.
actually
or yung
ganyan the
cancer.
way napakadali, napakasimple para sa akin yung mga ganyang klaseng metaphor. And metaphors are only useful
Lazy
to a certain
metaphor.
extent, but they limit our imagination.
Tama, tama. Isa pang metaphor yung cancer, which is an old one, right? The cancer of corruption. Corruption is a cancer. So
Rizal,
uh,
right? No limitang rin.
it's there, but more recently I was thinking, see James Wolfenson, the World Bank. You hear it all the time. How do you cure cancer? Radiation therapy, diba? I mean, you really need to destroy it, extirpate it. It really calls for strong medicine, and that's why, to your point, thinking thinking in such fundamentalist ways and in such asociological ways limits our political imagination. In fact, it negates the space for politics. And so if corruption is a cultural problem, if it's a pathology, the only way to solve it is some kind of powerful medicine in the form of a kind of autocratic figure, perhaps. So that's really the problem. It negates politics. But to your point, Richard, of course, who's for corruption after all? But corruption, you have to understand, is like a bludgeon, diba? It's used. We have to understand it's mobilized by. We have to look at the political agendas behind it, and it's a simple this notion that the choices between yung malinis tsaka yung korakot. It's a fairy tale. It's a simple way of saying if only we had this, and not really engaging with the dirty work, the difficulty of real politics. So, again, as a sociologist, you have to ask who's using this word and why, and what did they get from it. And it doesn't even have to be politicians. Now, syempre, politicians are always using it. They're slapping each other with the label, you're corrupt, no, you're corrupt, no, you're corrupt. But I think even ordinary people, like the middle class, there's something, like I said, morally consoling about it, morally comfortable. It gives you a kind of moral orientation. You feel righteous, diba? You feel like, oh yeah, I'm malinis ako. Bakit lahat sila madumi? What's wrong with everybody else but me? I mean, there's something mobilized. I mean, it makes you, it gives you a position. It gives you a kind of orientation. So it has appeal, right? But we shouldn't confuse that kind of moral appeal to. We shouldn't pretend that translates into an accurate analytical story about what's actually happening. For that, we need to take different perspectives into account. So no one is for corruption, but we need to think more in more complex ways, in broader ways about when we say corruption, what do we mean? Who's using it,
But
right?
that's it. That strawman attack shows us something is going on, right? And I think Lela, you were smiling kanina. Is
Maybe
there a
maybe I
cottage? Is there a cottage industry of an
maybe I just read a couple of lines from academics that show that I think really illustrates Marco's point. No, so this is a line from Paul Hutchcroft and the economist Emmanuel de Dios, and they say that the power of particularistic demands of the oligarchy, meaning corruption, ruins sound policy agenda on a national level. That's very sounds very highfalutin, but they're basically really saying doesn't really matter kung ano yung policy, sisirain lang din naman ng corruption yan.
Yeah.
Hopelessness, right? That clearly leads to hopelessness. Para kay pa yung ano natin, nag-advocate tayo for good policy, sisirain din naman pala ng oligarchy. I'll read another text naman. This one is from the Ateneo School of Government. Lead author si Ronald Mendoza. I like these people, of course, but sabi niya, ang matututunan natin from the corruption of the Marcos administration is that collusive rent seeking in the Philippines raises the need to ensure that the state serves as a fair regulator and not a direct market actor. In other words, he's saying dahil sobrang corrupt ng gobyerno, wag na mag-involve yung gobyerno sa merkado or sa pagtulong ng mga tao. In other words, retreat neoliberalism,
Yeah,
right?
tama,
So these
tama.
are both examples of people who are saying that because we're so corrupt, let's retreat from a policy making, let's a retreat from economics. So napakalinaw, it's not a conspiracy. It's there. They say it. They really say it.
But what you pointed out, Claude, Lelo is very right. I mean, there's an agenda at stake, diba? Or at the very least, there's an image of what the markets should look like, of what the government should look like, and it's a very particular image, diba? Free from any kind of interference, free from any kind of, corruption is just another word to get at markets that are distorted in some way. So this again, we need to understand that corruption is not an innocent or naive word. That it's loaded with all kinds of agendas and meanings, and that's really the only way. And only by understanding how complicated it is can we free ourselves from these simple morality tales.
Why do you think so? Because my suspicion is you're more the anthropologist here, but my suspicion is this is a kind of a combination of American colonial libertarian anti-state kind of late 19th century America kind of populist anti libertarian tradition, and also the kind of Catholic Spanish moralism, right? I kind of see a combination of those two. That's why I think it's particularly strong in the Philippines. Like I've looked at Asia Barometer surveys, for instance, right? People were
Yeah,
asked, should the state intervene for economic redistribution? Everyone is here, only Philippines is here saying, na hindi dapat makialam ang
yeah,
gobyerno. There's
yeah.
a very strong libertarian culture, which I suspect is from Americans, while also a very strong moralistic approach, which I believe is more Catholic Spanish influence. I know that sounds orientalizing, but no,
Mm-hmm.
I just see it as a very contingent combination of historical path dependency that can be corrected as long as we're conscious about it. Di ba, Marco? Parang yun ang medyo unique sa atin eh. There's this very Catholic, like moralistic, and at the same time, this very American, libertarian, anti-state thing, which makes us
Mm-hmm.
unique by Southeast Asian standards.
Well, yung sa akin yung problema doon sa simple story na yan is that there's no way out. First, it's a dead end. You know, when you say the solution is to get to clean government, but there's no real description of what that looks like. You know, so it's a moral position more than anything, right? And so corrupt is people I don't like or people who do things that I don't agree with, but you know, as long as I'm doing it, it's not corrupt. You know, it's a bludgeon. Like I said, first of all, it doesn't show us a path forward. So that's the first problem. The second problem is that it breeds this kind of negativity, diba? As we talked about. I mean, a kind of lack of confidence, self-doubt. What's wrong with us? Woe is me. That too is unproductive. It breeds a lack of trust, you know, a lack of self-confidence that we can do it. When in fact, you look at all of these indicators, there are grounds for progress, and not just economically. Economically, the case is clear, but I would argue even politically. You know, we're finding our way, but that's true of every country, right? I mean, the United States is lost in the dark woods today, and yet in our imagination, you know, clean, perhaps not anymore, but that day for sure, in our imagination, the image or the model of clean government and functional government is the United States. But look at where the United States is today. You know, it feels like you're lost in the woods. I was at a meeting, the Chicago Center of Democracy brought together all these political scientists, sociologists, lawyers, philosophers. And the question was, what is happening? What is happening? And syempre, we're academics, so we like to talk. The lawyers would say, well, it's ganito, ganito, ganito. The political scientists will say, you know, you have to understand it's blah, 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 blah. You know, we went around the room, and then the philosopher, the one guy, he said, I don't know what's going on. You know, I don't know. And that's the only true thing that was said in that room. Because in everybody's hearts, I think, I certainly felt
You
this
got
way.
the Socrates guy.
People felt completely disoriented. Everything they had taken for granted about how things should work. All, by the way, all the political science models that tell us that the United States was the least likely to backslide in this spectacular way. Look at its income, you know, look at its, you know, it runs in the face of all of this political science literature, and yet here we are. So no country, not the United States, certainly not the Philippines, is exempt from politics. We need to embrace it, and we need to try to you know, we can never control it perhaps, but we need to face it, confront it, and understand that that's the way forward. And so again, my concern with these simple morality tales is that they're ways of not engaging it, not engaging with our reality, and charting a way forward that's true to who we are based on who we are, you know. Not we don't want to become like Sweden, as they say, you know, or get to Denmark, as the World Bank says, but we have to develop within the parameters of who we are as a country, but we look elsewhere. So this is the problem for me.
Lele, you want to come on that point? Because I want to make it clear. We want to fight against corruption, but we want to understand first what we're dealing with before we properly fight it. I mean, like, okay, so Marco, the devil's advocate would say, okay, so obviously we're not just going to be okay with corruption. So what is the healthy way, constructive way of discussing corruption and dealing with corruption? Do we have any understanding on that, Marco? Are you going to be that philosopher to saying I don't know?
No, no, no. I'm not. The first thing I mean, I'm more a historian in this case. The first thing I would say is look at the historical record. We've been wrestling with corruption. There's been a strong anti-corruption movements impulse among Filipinos for a very long time, and you can see how it's changed. And the historical record is very, very clear. I mean, we've ousted two presidents on grounds of corruption. Corruption comes up all the time. There's nobody, it feels like, more sensitive to corruption, more corruption minded than we are, right? What's dangerous is becoming fundamentalist about it. That is to say, corruption drowns out everything else in the room, especially politics. And it becomes a question of kind of getting to some magical state of everybody, lahat malinis. You have to understand there are situations in which malinis is impossible precisely because of who, you know, the way things are done in our country sometimes. And so you need a more pragmatic approach to kind of getting to the outcomes that you want. It's not to say that we shouldn't try, we shouldn't struggle. Of course we should. That's the whole point of this project of political modernization. The problem is we hold ourselves to these inappropriate or unrealistic standards. There should be things we aspire for, but they should be realistic. By realistic, in other words, it should follow from who we are and how we do things, what makes sense to us, our values as a nation, all of these things, as contested as they are, right? Rather than we should look like Sweden, we should look like Denmark, by the World Bank. Getting to Denmark is how they talk about development these days. Uh,
Uh, can I
yeah,
press on that? I'll give you a
yeah,
I'm going to Denmark in 3 days inside this topic.
yeah.
I'll give a concrete example. So when the impeachment of Sarah moved forward,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
how do you think the votes came together? Because it was extremely risky to go against that. I'm not justifying or rationalizing anything, but going back to what you were saying, Marco, let's be realistic about, the parameters of politics in our country. The idea that those votes could come together and so many congressmen would risk their career, if not lives, to go against Duterte's, to hold Sara Duterte accountable
Yeah,
without
yeah.
something fishy going on, I felt was always very fanciful. Or to a certain extent, I would say even some people are hypocritical to pretend, oh, of course, because it was obvious Sara did something wrong, so that's why Congress is moving on that. It's just that the Senate is so terrible thanks to Jesus Codera and his eyebrows, right? That's my point. Um, and then now, suddenly, oh yeah, ang corrupt ng Kongreso, kadiri sila, yuck, yeah, yeah. Like, yes, but don't forget, probably the reason why a lot of mumbo jumbo happened is because the leadership had to get the votes together to impeach Sara Duterte. So you like the impeaching of Sara Duterte part, but you conveniently don't want to think how was the sausage made, right? Like you want the sausage. Now I'm giving a very concrete, difficult example, right? Because as someone who wants accountability from Duterte's,
Yeah,
and as someone who does political science and knows the reality, I'm
yeah, yeah.
super conflicted about this. So of course I want the corrupt people in the Congress to be held accountable, but I also do not forget that they had to put those numbers together to impeach Sara. Otherwise, wala, total impunity ang mga Dutertes.
Tama. You can't cherry pick, diba? Otherwise, you're just hypocritical, and you need to see it clearly, soberly. As you have to say, kung ganito, ganito ang ginawa nila with for Sara Duterte. I mean, as you pointed out, how else did they mobilize the votes, right? And so we have to be honest with ourselves about how politics works in this country, and only then can we be clear about what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. Of course, that's subject to a great deal of debate, contention, etc. But that's how it has to be, diba?
I'll
That's
bring
how it has to be.
I'll bring Lelo here
Richard,
because Lelo,
pwede ba akong magtanong sa'yo naman, Richard,
yeah, please,
as
please
a
go ahead.
kind
Yeah,
of
yeah.
political strategist? Kasi may element din dito ng political strategy, di ba? I feel like a lot of the progressive, na-addict sila sa anti-corruption message. So, for example, they were able to oust Estrada with it. Oh, proof of concept. Panalo tayo.
Yeah.
They were able to oust GMA in the sense na nanalo si Pinoy on an anti-corruption message. Oh, proof of concept. And then, nag-anti-corruption sila ni kung sa gobyernong tapat angat buhay lahat natalo. And maybe some of them were rethinking it. Pero suddenly nagkaroon ng DPWH scandal at maraming nagalit. And they're like, teka, alam kong hindi gumana last time yung anti-corruption pero ang lakas ng anger sa DPWH corruption. And so their priors are starting to become are starting to become stroked again or confirmed again by virtue of the DPWH scandal. So sasakyan na naman nila. In other words, they're looking for every single excuse to go back to the original script. Ang tanong ko, why are they so addicted to the same script? And
Right.
it's been happening. You can argue that it's been happening since magsaysay, di ba, yung script?
Like, so basically, my read of this is very Foucauldian, right? Like knowledge and power and narratives are all very related, right? Obviously, there's some people are just intellectual lazy. Like hanggang ito lang binasa kong textbook nung grad school ko, hanggang dyan na ako. Di na ako magbasa ng all the new publications and readings on the literature on corruption development. Okay. Putting those people aside, and I think Marco was actually already hinting at it, there's a cottage industry. There's a daan matuwid, good governance cottage industry. There are very people whose research, whose legacy, whose status, everything, not to mention their involvement in campaign, has to do with that line. All we need is tapat na gobyerno, everything else will be okay. Some of them maybe are even more cynical, like, oh, we don't want to talk about land redistribution. We don't want to talk about distributional economics or fiscal transfers. Let's just put it at the good governance kasi baka magalit yung mga oligarchs na tumutulong sa atin sa kampanya. Let's just be real talk about it, right, Leloy? So that's why it's interesting. Mar Rojas, from what I know, got this. He was aggressively pushing for transcending the Dan Matuwid discourse and policy agenda of Pinoy. Basically, sabi na, tignan mo yung surveys, ang hinahanap ng tao is a decisive, strong leader who gets infrastructure projects going. And thanks to Digong, also now dealing with crime. If you look at all the surveys in 2015, it showed, you mentioned this also, Lelo, based on poll station among others, hindi na naging issue yung poll. I mean, the very fact that Binay was still number one until February survey in 2016 tells you, I'm not sure good governance was really, really the
A
priority.
Marcos, Richard, a Marcos won a majority of the
Exactly, right?
electorate.
So 2015-16 pa lang, alam na natin, wala na yung halo ng anti-Arroyo, good governance, ganun-ganun. People were back to the basics. We want a decisive leader, effective leader. I call it effective leadership rather than just good governance, etc. And Marojas knew that. Marojas is a numbers guy. He's a smart guy. He saw the number. And he had a big debate with not only Pinoy, but some people around him. But from what I know from insiders, his hands were forced. Hindi. Ikaw, may utang na loob ka. You're only there because of Pinoy. You're here to continue his legacy. So as some political scientists like July Tiangki joke, iPhone 1 pa rin yung inoffer nung 2016. Basically, yung kabila, Huawei 6 na. Di ba? Like si Digong, di ba? Kaya napagbaya. So actually, Maro has got what we're saying. That, yes, dapat anti-corruption, but you have to go beyond that. You have to talk about welfare. You have to talk about maybe manufacturing, better investments. He got it because he's a numbers game. He's an international investor. He understood that picture. But if Maroas Leloy felt he didn't have the room for maneuver to go beyond that simplistic Dan Matuwid kind of discussion, which perfectly made sense in 2010, but was a little bit palaos na in 2015-16, then that makes us understand bakit hanggang ngayon we're struggling to break through, Leloy, right? Like, now we are all being attacked as being, oh, ano daw, pro-corruption tayo or we downplay corruption, right? Parang, how on earth is saying corruption is not the only problem, saying that corruption is not a problem? I just don't get it. Which
Well,
makes me
well,
think
the other,
there's no
Richard,
goodwill here. There's something ongoing.
gusto ko ring tanong sa inyo ni Marco though, yung idea of breaking through because it does seem like we are at an inflection point in terms of changing the discourse. Because in academia, of course, in political science, oligarchy, rent seeking, these have been the bad words for 40 years na. So
Yeah.
siguro nagsasawa na rin yung mga tao. And Richard, you've been doing so much work on industrial policy, on economics, and people are listening. And then Marco, of course, you found an audience sa Pilipinas among our colleagues at the Institute of Philippine Culture, and of course, we're working on a book with them. So what is it about this point? Is it just because nagsawa ng mga tao? It's been 40 years of this of the same thing, or why are certain people looking for new things? And we came to these conclusions, the three of us, independently of each other, and so many other people are coming up with the same conclusions.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great moment. I mean, in some ways, it is a hopeful moment. At this, ironically, at the same time as it's kind of a dire moment in some ways, also, diba? Why? That's let me take a few guesses. Some guesses have to do with just the trajectory of democracy in the country over the past 40 years. I mean, from the late 80s forward, the 90s in some ways was the high point of the democratization agenda. And then, you really have to go through it. But by the time that Arroyo, this 10-year dark age that she took over, that really soured a lot of people. And I think that they realized that maybe this whole consolidation agenda, this whole it's too susceptible to being hijacked, to being something turned, something soured. The euphoria of people power in the late 80s dissipated. It's gone, diba? I mean, and so that paved the way for the election of Duterte by a margin, by a slim margin at first. But what's interesting about Duterte, he barely won, diba? I mean, what was it, 36, 39%? And as Richard pointed out, it was really
38%, I think. Just
it's
38.
really the middle class who kind of were the opinion leaders. They saw something in him that other people didn't. But ironically, it was over the course of his administration, over the bloody drug war, that support increased, including among the poor, and those were the communities that he targeted. I mean, those are the real questions for political scientists today. I mean, political scientists, political sociologists, all of us broadly, we need to understand this, and the answer does not lie in going back to that old paradigm of, we need to consolidate democracy, we need to make a clean government. None of those paradigms are futile, and so part of it, I think, is the events have gotten to a point where the old ways of making sense, the old analytical frameworks just feel broken, diba? They feel insufficient. So I think people in different disciplines are feeling that. And the last thing I would add, there's of course an economic story also. We're no longer the basket case of Asia. So that's changing things. But the other thing I would add is, this idea of democratic consolidation, that we should aim to become this true democracy, and we had this image of the United States, that too is lost. I mean, globally, the normative order has changed. People increasingly are looking to Singapore or to China or these kinds of places. And so, I mean, I understand why. I mean, you look at what the Capitol riots in January 6 here in the United States, it looks like it's a tres, and people are saying, well, why would I want to look like that? Or the way COVID was handled. And so part of it is our imagination is forced to change because the old North Star, wala na. It's not as bright. It's no longer serving to guide us. So I think it's a complicated story, but to my mind, these things are dragging us into the future. I don't know if we, independently, it's exciting because we're all kind of coming to this from different ways, but we're not quite there yet. We're at the beginning of something. It doesn't feel like the end of history, diba? Sa 1990s, sabi ni Francis Fukuyama, end of history. In other words, our imagination has gone as far as it can. Liberal democracy is the end point. It doesn't feel like that. It feels like the beginning, doesn't it? It feels like the beginning of something. But we're not sure yet. We're still trying to articulate what that is. My point is, we are being dragged forward because our analytical frameworks are being slowly busted, broken, stretched. They don't work.
That's why a heterodox approach would make sense. I mean, I'm doing a lot of public policy analysis here at Oxford. So we're looking at best practices even from post-colonial global South countries. Like what did Ecuador get right on this pension issue? What Colombia get? We're no longer looking at what US. In fact, I like what's happening now because US was never really an ideal democracy. I think
Ever.
na-expose lang yung pagka-scam. I mean, I love US, but like we always knew it was not, for anyone who has studied Scandinavian countries, even Western Europe, they would know it was never ideal. I'm excited because yes, the old order is dying and the new one is being born in ways that allows for a more pluralistic narrative and discourse. Whereby you look at best practices not only in Singapore or Tianjin, right? You're also looking at cases in Africa, Latin America, among other things. I was just talking to some colleagues from Colombia about their FARC peace negotiations, what we can learn from them on issues of ICC and ICJ. I talk more to Latin Americans or Eastern Europeans, no longer with the Americans, for instance, on this issue, right? So I don't know. For me, there's an opening here, and that's where I'm glad that Lelo is there because. I think Lelo being an iconoclast was always, this is perfectly your time, Lelo. This is your time. Pag-usapan natin yung reversal of the memes. So, di ba yung sinabi natin, hindi dapat kung ano yun, kung walang corrupt, walang mahirap. Dapat kung walang kahirapan, walang corruption. Let's do that. Let's do the bumpers.
Ito yung economics, ito naman yung economics part, Richard. Naunahan mo na ako dun sa kung walang kahirapan, walang corrupt. Ang gusto ko naman the one thing I wanna forward naman ngayon is pag umangat ang buhay ng lahat, ang gobyerno ay nagiging tapat.
Nagiging tapat. Oh, exactly. Which is modernization theory in a sense,
Which is
right?
correct, diba? I mean, that's
Which
the way
is
it's
correct.
always been everywhere.
It's a modernization theory, but it's correct. It is correct because when you build wealth, you build middle class. Once you build middle class, in Kuznets curve yan, diba? As there's more people who are middle class, I mean, tayo, we're middle class, we're not rich. So mahirap tayo ma-vote buying, right? It's not because we're morally superior, we
Right.
just have more
Right.
room for maneuver. It's no
Yeah.
rocket science. So
Yeah.
tama si Leloy, payamanin lang muna natin ang Pilipinas. But
Tama.
Leloy, just for the
Pero
sake,
actually, pero on the ground then, I think there's also something really insensitive about telling people nagugutom kayo, mag-rally kayo against corruption and vote buying. Mali yun eh. Mali
Tama.
yun. And ayun yung
Tama.
problem sa moralistic discourse, di ba? Wala ba kayong pakialam sa bayan? Nagpapabili kayo ng boto? Ini-endorse nyo yung corruption? Ikaw nga, ikaw kaya magutom ka. Di ba?
Yeah.
Hindi ka tatanggap
pero
ng
gutom lang
limandaan,
ba
isang
yan,
libo.
Leloy? Actually, di
Or
ba, there's yeah,
mawalan ng
there's a lot of
serbisyo, right?
literature that
Yeah.
actually can be threatened by, like in some areas, again, I don't want to be persona non grata, but I've seen studies whereby there are mechanisms of monitoring and enforcement for vote buying. Sabihin natin, etong barangay binigay ng pera ng etong warlord na yan. If for some reason that barangay doesn't deliver certain quota number, medyo parang Singapore style, biglang wala ng infrastructure project. That's the mild situation. But they could be. In fact, there's even like Facebook monitoring. Meron daw mga people who are asked to spy on others kung binabadmouth nila yung mga dynasties who are doing vote buying, etc. Right? So so Lelo, it's not only about desperation. It's also actually there's a climate of fear and enforcement that a lot of us are privileged enough not to ever experience or to not know
Mm.
about. Kaya this is where I love Cardinal David. Di ba? Sabi ni Cardinal David, huwag tayo blame let's not blame the victims. Kaya nga tayo mga middle class who have more political agency. Everyone has political agency, but it's differential, right? We have to step up. The last thing we should do is to fall for this horrible Bobotante narrative, which Marco, you have been doing a fantastic job. Do you want to go back to that Bobotante
Oo nga,
narrative?
Marco,
Because
can you
that's
talk to us about
it's a
yung
tres.
ano, yung pearl clutching history of anti-corruption
Let's do
discourse,
that.
yung tita
Let's
pearl
go,
clutching
Marco.
history. Kasi marami ka rin kinausap ng mga pearl clutching titas apart from talking to people on the ground sa mga urban poor community, di ba?
Pearl clutching titas. That's a wonderful phrase. Yeah, you know,
Magaling si
even
Leloy sa ganun eh.
oh,
Magaling,
maganda,
magaling.
maganda, magaling. Um, you know, even to say something is vote buying or patronage already kind of fixes its meaning. But if you go to some of these communities, they don't see it this way necessarily. You know, it's true that if you look at the surveys, mukhang everybody's against corruption. But people actually have different ideas about what corruption is depending on their social position and their situation, diba? I mean, for some people, maybe it's, you know, if you're looking down, maybe for you, it's the vote buying and other things. Maybe it's the squatting, you know, these kinds of things. But certainly, if you're down and you're looking up, corruption for you looks completely different. It's the people who keep you out, the people who deny you your rights, your, you know, all these kinds of things. So you're pointing out the importance of social class in the Philippines, particularly in Metro Manila, and the way that in some ways, you know, class is of course relational. Ibig sabihin that, you know, people understand the group they belong to by looking at other groups, diba? And so in the Philippines, it's very, very sharp, especially in Metro Manila. And so this so-called pearl clutching titas, you know, their sense of who they are. And like I said, there's a kind of moral consolation, a moral orientation or comfort that comes from saying, we're not like those people, yung mga bobotantes. We stand for what's good, what's true, what's beautiful.
Sorry,
Diba?
I don't wanna gender it. Pearl clutching titas
Or
and let's
titos,
say
Tito
cigars,
Fortuners.
SUV driving
Tito
tito.
Fortuners.
yeah, it's funny kasi it's parang it's a type na, 'di ba? I mean, you say it, everybody knows, everybody has a picture in their mind of who you're talking about. But yeah, you know, I mean, it's important, I think, as analysts to be wary of self-righteousness because it serves a purpose. It gives people a sense of identity, a sense of who they are. Um, and so you have to see past it. At the same time, you know, it's not to discount these people. These people are simply making sense of their own position, of their own situation. And from their point of view, syempre, to them, what they call the squatter is a source, is a threat. They see it in a particular way, right? And so my point is, these perspectives are not really reconcilable. The world is composed of very contradictory perspectives, and you need to understand that, you know, people in particular positions learn to see the world in a particular way. But it also makes sense that people in different positions may see the world in a completely opposite way. our job is to understand the coexistence of these different perspectives, diba? Not to try to reconcile them into one correct versus incorrect perspective. I think, I mean, that's what politics should do. It should accommodate these different views. It should work it out rather than try, so this is, getting back to my problem with the whole moralistic discourse of corruption. In some ways, it's full of these agendas, social agendas, political agendas that we just don't see. It makes them invisible. And it's our job to shine a light on them. So again, I don't want to, again, I'm not against corruption, whatever that means. Syempre, I want a politics that's emancipatory, that's good that leads to everybody's flourishing, whatever that means. But there are many, but you have to do that, you have to take people into account and you have to understand how they see things. And politics is really the only way that people kind of work out their different issues and their different perspectives. So it's about making space for that.
Meron akong, Richard, I want to offer a very concrete example of the best anti-corruption program that worked for a very long time pero gumuho pa rin dahil hindi na-solve yung problems of inequality and yung underlying class problems ng lipunan. So Marco mentioned in the late 1990s, early 2000s, there was a huge push on the part of the IMF for anti-corruption institutions. One institution that they really funded and they made sure that this institution would be set up in Indonesia. Kung hindi i-set up ng Indonesia tong institution na to, i-deny nila ng IMF funding. This was called the KPK, or the Anti-Corruption Commission of Indonesia, right? So the IMF was
Which
really like,
Jokowi abolished later on.
hindi namin kayo papautangin kung hindi kayo mag-establish ng hyper-independent anti-corruption commission. And for the longest time, the KPK was the jewel in the crown of the IMF and their anti-corruption agenda. Because magaling naman talaga yung KPK na-interview ko ng mga to. And then, they even won the Magsaysay Award. So we celebrated them in the Philippines, which is kind of telling, right? We really love our anti-corruption agencies in the Philippines. Ano nangyari? Ano nangyari dun sa Jokowi administration and ngayon dito sa Prabowo administration? Completely and utterly defanged. And people didn't care. Were people out in the streets making sure na the Anti-Corruption Commission would stay? Yeah, maybe. But ultimately, I think people are in the streets in Indonesia not because of anti-corruption, they're there because of inequality. Yun pa rin yung driving force ng social activism. So, even the most successful anti-corruption effort, strong institution, kumbaga, supported by the international community, kung hindi mo masolve yung underlying economic problems, hindi siya gagana.
And just to be clear, Jokowi was one of the reasons Jokowi tried to define it. I'm not justifying it. Was because he understood they need infrastructure development. Remember, one of the biggest legacies of Jokowi was massive infrastructure development. And alam niya, kailangan yan in a way to create growth, but also to help with inequalities, right? Kasi kung better public infrastructure, easier for ordinary people to go work, etc. So ang problema niya is yung KPK masyado daw politicized, or it introduces a lot of gridlocks that was slowing down Indonesia's ability. So Jokowi was very consciously shameless about saying napapabagal ang development ng Indonesia dahil sa KPK na yan. Diba? I'm not defending it. And I think I generally am sympathetic to the KPK thing. But you're right, Leloy. If we are for fighting corruption, but we want it in a sustainable way. And the only way for it to be sustainable is to go beyond a corruption-obsessed discourse, but rather go into a more comprehensive reform package. That's what we're saying, right? Kung purong corruption lang discourse mo, pero hindi mo galawin yung inequality, yung dynastic politics, oligarchy capture of commanding economies, wala kang industrial policy, at some point, magka-catch up din sa'yo yan eh. At some point, something is gonna go wrong, even with the best well-intentioned and well-organized.
I'm curious both of you, 'di ba? Kasi ito na yung common. Actually pinapakinggan tayo ng mga tao and they have gotten defensive, and the big line right now is it's not mutually exclusive naman. We can do
Which is what
both.
we say
We can
too,
still
right?
run our old anti-corruption campaign, and then focus on things like services and industrial policy. But Richard, you said something. You said something sa isang interview mo, but this is a campaign, and when you're doing politics, you need campaign discipline, right? And if you have a mixed message, patay ka. And somebody commented nga on my wall kanina, hindi pwede yung ganung nuance sa campaign because si Bongbong Marcos nga at si Sara, one word lang, unity eh. Kung magkampanya ka, we are for anti-corruption but we're also for social services and we also want a developmental state. Yung ganun kahaba. Like,
Wag workshop ka.
how does that
Yeah, then better have a workshop. You're right. You need bumper stickers, diba? Like Ma'am Dani, right? Like just one, two things, right? Like low rent, right? Childcare, that's it. Wala nang debate about structure. We can have that on the sides. Pero bumper sticker ang kailangan natin. Which is where I want to go back to you, Marco, because I know
Mm.
you're not a political strategist. I know you're not a pundit, but I hope to juice you out more as we discuss this discussion. Because Marco, you have been talking to the disenfranchised, the alienated sections of our society, including a lot of those who just gave up on our democracy or keep on looking for an ERAP or Digong or etc. Even though proportionally the ABC was more for Digong, the reality is that the D is the biggest voting population, right? So if we
Yeah.
don't have the D on our side,
Yeah.
hopeless case tayo.
Yeah.
So Marco, you're not a political strategist, you're not a political scientist, but as a political sociologist, what is the way back to win them over? Aside from don't be sanctimonious schmuck, basically, telling them how horrible you are for holding all of us back. Aside from that, what should we do? How can we win back the working class? I know it sounds like US elections, but how can we
Yeah.
win the D from your research?
Oh, wow. Well, you're right. It's not
Preliminary
about.
lang, preliminary. You don't have to give a final answer. This is a punditry show. This is not an academic scholar.
Ganito na lang, Risha. Let me give you a story. Let me share a story. Kwento ko na lang from my recent field work, no? So, as you know, sobrang popular si Digong sa D&E areas, sa mga urban poor areas. And I got interested about the areas that were targeted by yung drug war niya, 'di ba? So there are maps that show the drug war was worst in terms of casualties. At first, early on in 2016 sa Manila, Tondo, Santa Ana, these places. Later on in Caloocan and then Bulacan. Anyway, so I said, okay, let me find out for myself because when I did field work in other places, Tigong seemed quite popular and I was trying to understand why. So I said, well, let me go to the places where the drug war was worst to see if, in fact, he's still popular. So I went to Tondo. I spent about a month in Tondo talking to people. There's a lot to talk about, but let me just talk about one interview, diba? This was with a barangay captain. So the barangay captain was telling me that when he heard Duterte was, running, he was excited. But he also went to talk to his son because his son was a drug dealer, right? So sabi niya sa anak niya, anak, seryoso to. You need to stop. This guy is serious. Iba to. Hindi katulad ng iba. And then he said, sabi ng kapitan, the son said to me, sabi ng anak ko sa akin, Dad, kung patay ako, patay. So sabi ng dad, okay. And sure enough, he was killed, right? In the course of the drug war, the son was killed. And then I was a little, I mean, that's a lot about us. So sabi ko, so, it was confusing to me because until he told me that story, he was telling me how much he supported Duterte and how much good the drug war had done in his barangay in Tondo. And so I was confused. It was a puzzle. I mean, it was a real puzzle, a puzzle out there in the field. And sabi ko sa kanya, I don't understand, sir. Your son was killed, and yet you support this man and you support this campaign, this tokhang. And then he looked at me like, what are you asking me? Sabi niya, he's sad that his son died, pero the son was resigned. But he said, look at the community. People feel safer. Drugs, you have to understand. So the point I'm trying to make here is that until we're able to understand how this man makes sense of politics, there's no way forward. I mean, you can talk to all the pundits you want, you can develop the strategies you want, but unless you understand I'm not saying it's right, to be clear, I'm not condoning it, but from his point of view, his community was safer. So until we understand the meaning of drugs for him in his country, right? So put aside, I want to win
Yun yung
this
life
election.
world na. We have to understand their life world. Yeah.
Exactly. Until we understand in the context of his community how much it meant that there was a reduction in the disorder, the usual disorder of it. Again, we don't have to condone, we don't have to like, but we have to try to understand until we can understand something that, I mean, for me was just so hard. Even now, I'm trying to kind of explain it. Until we get to that, then we'll never understand why, as you pointed out kanina, yung popularity in the very places where Tokhang was worst are sky high. And I think that is for a person like me who's committed to ethnography to understand. I mean, that's the real puzzle. But I also think Philippine politics, to really kind of get at the very heart of it, will really have to reckon with that very concrete question. It's not just a question of better strategies versus worse. I mean, clearly, he's not talking about corruption. He's talking about basic things like security, like safety, like feeling like you can, that to me is the real puzzle. So I don't have really a strategy, but I think of that. I think of that as the real puzzle to try to kind of unpack Philippine politics. Why Digong is so popular today, and maybe also why Marcos
Mhm.
was reelected.
Well, ako, in defense of my colleagues in the political science world, we
Yeah,
have come to appreciate that there is no coherent ideological, life world when people vote, right?
yeah,
It's
yeah, yeah, yeah,
instinctive, it's visceral, right?
yeah,
It could be completely dissonant,
yeah,
right? But if it makes sense at an instinctive level, then the voters are going to do what they're going to do. So I think we have to get rid of this nonsense rational choice theory, blah, blah, blah. There's
yeah.
no coherence, right?
Yeah, but my point, Richard, is that Digong tapped into it. He tapped into something. I mean, you don't have to like the guy. Syempre, if you actually look at what he's done, it's pretty horrific. If you look at the casualty count, the body count in these places, but you can't discount the fact that people are really responding to him in a very powerful way. It's like, even compared to Erap, honestly, it's like nothing I've ever seen. The way they talk about Duterte, it's 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 quite it's quite startling.
You don't buy again, like he's very charismatic. I've met Digong, I've met
Yeah, yeah,
countless
yeah,
people. He is, I'll give it to that. I mean, almost like
yeah,
psychopath level of, I mean, they were like
yeah,
psychopaths
yeah,
are
yeah, yeah,
super
yeah, yeah,
charismatic.
yeah, yeah.
I 100% get you.
Ah,
What I just want to understand here is like, okay, so what is the suggestion here that we become manipulative of emotions
no, no,
here?
I'm
Like,
saying that the old way of thinking about politics, corrupt or malinis,
yeah, yeah, absolutely.
that's not gonna sell. That belongs to an old time, diba? And especially for this barangay captain, um, those kinds of appeals, they feel they feel empty, diba? And so I think until there's a politics that speaks to this man, and like it or not, in some ways, Duterte is the closest that he's kind of this guy feels like his world has changed for the better, like it or not. Until we have a
Yeah, and that's
politics
his
that speaks
political
to it.
reality. Absolutely. We have to deal with that.
Yeah,
Leloy, what
yeah.
do you think about it? Like, kasi Leloy, ikaw yung una nagsabi eh. Again, see, I love na love kita, Leloy. I always give you credit. Aren't you amazing?
I
I
love
give
you
you
both. Okay, okay.
No, but Leloy, remember you said Digong is a master rhetorician, right? This is when all of us, I mean, Mark, like I and Leloy, we're all debaters. We have this idea of what is eloquence, right? We're like the classics. But all of us, like, galing na tong gagong to. Like ako personally, nakita ko Digong, every time na board yung audience, nagmumura siya. He's a stand-up comedian level of entertainer. Like, ang galing nung basa niya ng room, yung timing niya. And obviously, we got a more or less half-senile version of him. I was talking to some of his critics in Mindanao. We're saying, nako Richard, pag nakita mo yun nung 50s, 40s pa siya, mas madaldal pa yan sa'yo, sabi nila. Ang galing, pwede siya mag-usap ng Marxist dialectics, and then biglang babae and beer, and then biglang yung M16 na. I think he's a singularly dynamic politician, definitely, right? Like Lele, you had a lot to say this. You were the one who said we now have no longer Philippine studies but Duterte studies. Like,
Si Jojo Abenales, I think I took that from Jojo Abenales or maybe Mark Thompson, yung Duterte Studies Cottage Industry, not Philippine Studies. I like the word that Marco used, security. Duterte makes people feel safe. And I think the way forward is to find other ways of making people safe. na hindi lang dictatorship or
Mm,
authoritarianism. And I think na kung meron kang healthcare, kung meron kang edukasyon,
mm, mm,
kung nakakakain ka, that contributes to an overall feeling of security and well-being.
mm.
Kasi there's a particularly ungenerous way of reading that man, Marco, which is to say na ang babaw mo naman. Gusto mo lang yung psychological benefit na feel mo safe ka, pero napatay yung anak mo, wala kang pakialam, di ba? Ang babaw mo naman.
Mm.
The more generous way of reading that, I think, is that there is a genuine desire, meron talagang hangarin yung mga Pilipino na matugunan yung kanilang hangarin para to feel safe, to feel secure. And if we redefine security as kind of more total, I think that's a way forward for the
At saka
opposition.
yung feeling na napakinggan sila, 'di ba? I mean, literally Digong speaks the language of the street. And even though hindi ako ganong ka-gangster magsalita, natatawa talaga ako minsan sa like this guy, like he can get away with anything. Like sobrang palpak niya sa pandemic and then like hindi ko nga rin alam gagawin ko, mag-whiskey na lang ako, like he's really good. I mean, he's a
Mm,
natural. So, this is where I want to end, Mark, because I know you have to move forward, but
mm.
Marco, welcome. This is how we podcast. We go 10 hours, no problem. Apparently, some people bother to. But isa-slice ko naman yan, so don't worry. No, but
Sige.
Marco, yung part na they wanna be hurt, they wanna feel they exist. Clearly,
Yeah,
yun ang hindi nila nakukuha dun sa sanctimonious, I don't know, Tito Fortuner, Pearl Clutching Titas, all
yeah,
of
yeah,
these, daan matuwid discourse. At saka ano yun, let me educate you, right? Some friend did during election, right? And they
yeah.
did it in my town, in Baguio. You never tell taga Baguio people. And you're from, let me, sisigawan ka talaga doon. So, Marco, how can we make folks feel they're being heard? Aside from being less conyo like me and Leloy.
I like what Leloy said about security. You know, apart from Duterte's rhetoric, they felt like parang may substance yung salita niya. They felt like it's not just that he's a good speaker. It felt like he's talking about something that they really care about. And that's to go back to this point about the corruption that's pushed to that falls flat, diba? That's not for the so-called D class. This is not a topic that has legs. You know, maybe they don't like it in general, but it's when they feel that their communities are safer that they get excited and that they really get excited, and that excitement comes from the contrast. They say this is the first time that there's been a president where I felt it here, me, humble in my humble community, where I felt these effects. I mean, in some ways, it's disturbing because it's Duterte. At the same time, I mean, you have to understand where these people are coming from. And so, if the question is, how do people feel heard? A very concrete way of answering that is saying you talk about things that they actually care about. And for so long we've neglected security, but how basic is that? Diba? I mean, it's not just I have enough food to eat, but my kids can walk to school, I can send my kids to educate. I mean, these are people who everything they do, all their energies goes to making sure their kids pakatapos lang yung mga anak ko. 'Di ba? Hindi lang sa sixth grade, pero sa high school. Oh, college pa. May libreng college. Malaking bagay yan, 'di ba? All of a sudden, I can send them to these things. Once you understand that, and these are aspirations that are honorable aspirations, you begin to realize that in some ways, all this hot air about all these campaigns and they're not attuned to the real world of people. You know, maybe their incentives are set from universities in the United States or elsewhere, and their funding comes from
NGOs,
yeah,
international.
exactly. But you realize that parang they're not listening to the people, their
Correct.
yayas, their helpers, their drivers. I mean, and this is most of the country, and then you begin to see that there's this huge disconnect.
Correct.
So politically, it's not actually complicated. They're right there. You just need to kind of understand that they're struggling, and if you can ease that struggle in some way for really honorable developmental aspirations, pakatapos lang, 'di ba? So there's some mobility. I mean that to me, if there's a candidate who can do that, and that's the issue, I have no doubt that that person from the bottom will be embraced.
Absolutely, absolutely. Kaya nga gusto ko yung ginawa ni Ma'am Danya eh. Unang-una, kinausap niya yung mga bumoto kay Trump. bakit niyo binoto si Trump? And then nung
Yeah.
napakinggan niya, ikaw, tatakbo ka ng mayor, alam mo, bobotohin kita kung tumakbo ka. And then he ran the next year, di ba? I love it when Ma'am Dani did that. It's like, maybe we should
Yeah.
do the same. Punta tayo sa mga komunidad na pro-Duterte, except I'm persona non grata in some of these cities. But if I feel safe enough, I'll go. Ako sabi, bakit yung gusto si Digong? Actually, one of the best times I had was in Davao, debating about Digong. And
Yeah.
they were curious about, like, anong take mo, ano bang pag-intindi mo kay Duterte, ganun, ganun. I completely agree. I think, this is where Lelo is right, and to connect it to Huntington, like the argument of Huntington is that as economic growth happens, there's more social mobilization, more demand for change, but state institutions tend to be slow in responding
Yeah.
to that. And in that gap, you create disaffection. So yung
Mm.
sinasabi ni Lelo is actually correct to a degree that one of the reasons we got a Digong is because actually our economy was growing very fast, and more people were having cars, more people were having self. Because Marco, have you noticed the people who are super pro Digong at large chunk of our population are upper D. Yung kaka-cellphone lang, yung call center yung anak niya,
Ah,
yung bago pa lang yung kotse niya. Ano pa rin,
ah.
lower middle income or
Mm, mm.
aspirational middle class. Yun
Yeah.
ang napansin ko. At magmarunong din mag-Ingles, ha. Isa sa mga pinaka nagre-rebut sa akin online na nag-English, tinignan ko yung background, ito yung mga nag-aral sa, not maybe UP Ateneo Lasal, but the other tier of
Yeah.
grade schools, magaling
Mm,
mag-English, lumalaban, at talagang attack nila, kayo mga dilawan, kayo mga whatever,
mm, mm.
hindi nyo kami pinapakinggan, hindi nyo naintindihan how
Tama,
much
tama.
it feels for us to feel safer. Na ngayon
Exactly.
lang ako nagkaroon ng iPhone or bagong kotse or
Yeah.
nag-move ako dito sa apartment ko na bago. Dati may attic, wala na. So yung D1, D plus na yan or D1, I
Mm,
think that's
mm.
a very important sociological insight na pwede mong makuha dyan. On that note, thank you very much, gentlemen. Like Marco, Lela, this turned out okay. I mean, no
Thank you.
regrets ka naman, Marco, no? No regrets.
Salamat, salamat, salamat. I
This
had
was
Salamat.
a lot of
fun.
fun. I haven't had this much fun
This,
in a long time.
Yeah.
Wow,
this was
salamat.
good. We should have next
Thank you,
time, ano
Judge.
na to, parang Duterte style, parang Birao style, mag-usap tayong ganun. That was in-person podcast. So, Professor Marco Garrido, Professor of Sociology at the University of Chicago, thank you so much for joining us. So, what is your upcoming book again? Bad Words? Can you
It's
tell us?
called Bad Words. Bad
Bad,
words, bad words.
bad Words. So I'm sure a lot of things we discussed kanina, including one.
I have a volume with Lelo is a contributor. It's called Beyond Bad Words.
Yeah.
Beyond. Yeah.
Ayan. And of course, our extraordinary iconoclast. Lila, what's your new book again? Congratulations.
Ayun, Profligate Colonial.
Ayun. Ang galing talaga ni Lelo. Ano? Ako, I'm still
Ano ba
working
yan?
on my 50 Shades of Hedging book on China's relations with
Bago.
Southeast Asian countries. Like so.
May pictures pa, may pictures.
Ay, may mga... Okay.
X-rated.
On
May
that note,
centerfold.
absolutely. Thank you. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining us from different time zones, from UC Berkeley, from University of Chicago, and also, of course, here from University of Oxford. Thank you so much. Let's have more of this. Marco, uwi ka naman sa Pilipinas, di ba? Sabi mo sa amin, ha?
July. Sige,
And then
sige.
pagpunta naman namin sa Chicago, we'll drop by you. At least, if I'm welcome, I
Of
suppose.
course. Of course, of course.
God bless.
Anytime.
And Leloy, thank you so much. Bigla, last minute, sabi ko, sama ka naman para
Thank
exciting.
you. No, I just really wanted to eavesdrop and I enjoyed myself very
Oh,
much.
please. You're more than
Thank you.
eavesdrop. And by the way, I just forwarded the link to this discussion to some of our friends. Like, I
Okay.
already got the war going.
Sige. Let's keep
Salamat.
talking. Sige,
God
bye-bye.
bless.
Okay.
Of course.
Thank you, everyone.
Salamat.